I think the book is very, very sad and very...
What's wrong with that? I mean, you could read
well, people have an awful lot of sadness in their lives. There is this idea abroad, I don't necessarily share it, but I mean there is in existence an idea that artists should all artists should in some ways entertain. Now, I don't think that the central function of poetry is to entertain, but if it can entertain, some people have been very successful with that.
But that's not, I mean, sorry, I have no idea what you were
Okay.
So, but what I love about it is when it reminds me of things that I'm numb from. Like you can't walk around heartbroken all the time because it's so hard. It's just impossible physically. But then you want to, because it's good to remember that. So that's for me when I read those parts of your book that are so heartbreaking. I love that.
Yeah, but
so it's not I want to be entertained, I want to be heartbroken.
You want to be heartbroken.
Just me personally. So.
Well, the point about, no, but you see, you said that every now and again you are not heartbroken and therefore you want to go back into the heartbroken because you enjoy it.
Not because I enjoy it. Well,
because you feel that it's
real. It's
real, it's necessary, and so on. Chemical depressives are heartbroken 100% of the time, in one form or another. There was a very good piece on Leonard Cohen, not long ago in, I think, The Guardian, the English Guardian, and Leonard gave an absolutely precise description of what this thing is in something like 3.5 to 4 lines. And he said, well, you know, people who've never had that particular complaint have no idea whatsoever what it's like. And he'd gotten over it, he said, in part, by going to Tassajara Harbor for 7 years. I think he lived at this Zen monastery in California. I think, I can't remember exactly, I'd have to look back at the article, but I think he said that it came back every now and again, but and he didn't mention medication because there is, of course, stuff that people take which keeps them above a certain, keeps them from jumping in the river. But I think the fundamental strain from chemical depression remains forever. I mean, right through from birth to death. I don't think there's any way of getting away from it. So, yeah, that's really all I can say about it. And frustration is just one of the little faces that this demon puts on. You know, the demon puts on a different face every day, every moment. It's a slightly different thing.
This is a totally changing gears completely question. Ready? What advice, well you had this experience last night a little bit. What advice would you give high school students who want to write poetry? We had
Forget it. I've written a lot about this for a very long time and made myself very unpopular. But from the beginning of my experiences, particularly in this country, but now it's all over the world. I've been totally against this whole creative writing business, which occurred, started occurring after World War II, and has become, I think, a plague. Now, this is a very complex business because. And it really would take a long time to talk out. But on the one hand, in a democracy, there's no way, or an alleged democracy, there is no way of stopping people, forbidding people, discouraging people, etc., who want to be poets, or painters, or musicians, or whatever. But let's just talk about poetry. On the other hand, sociologically speaking, and you know, I'm still an anthropologist behind all of this, although I actually gave up the practice of anthropology, what, 30 years ago or so. It is a phenomenon which has totally changed the picture of the production and reception of poetry in our time. And while on the democratic side of the argument you can say, well, poetry is a good thing, so the more people make poetry, you know, the gooder and gooder and gooder the thing gets. But on the other hand, what you're neglecting is that although it is the creative writing teacher's job to make every one of his or her students believe that they have a poet's baton in their backpack, and can therefore go on to a glorious career with, you know, university jobs and awards and prizes and appreciations and honorings and all the rest of it. In actual fact, that's impossible. And so these young people are being misled. And the other side of all of that is that it gums up it gums up the field of publishing to an incredible extent. I mean, because the poetry turf is extremely small. I mean, it's about this size. And you've got hundreds and hundreds and thousands of people pouring into this, fighting for a place in the sun in this little bit of turf. And again, it's impossible. So, and you know, so all notions of traditional lineage, heritage, all the rest of it, all of that goes out the window. All of it goes out the window. Life has changed. That's another name for life has changed, yeah. But do I like it? No.
Shifting gears again, we just have a few more questions.
Also, it's a bloody life. It's a very, very horrible, difficult life. So why should I, or anybody else, encourage kids to get into this? Unless, you know, you can see the holy doves, you know, floating over their heads. You can actually see that this is going to be somebody. That's another story. But then I would say, you know, private mentorship, perhaps. Looking after somebody that you see is, you know, that's on an individual basis. But in the classroom and all of that stuff, forget it. If I was czar of culture, I would totally, I would get the arts out of the university, take them all out again into art colleges, poetry colleges, whatever you want. Leave the university to the traditional disciplines. And anybody who really fancies that they want to be a poet or something, for God's sake, you know, take a degree in English, take a degree in history, take a degree in law, take a degree in, or go out and become a plumber, go out and do something, you know, useful, and incidentally it pays. Get yourself a life in perhaps a craft which has a language attached to it. There are still some ancient crafts that you can probably access, which have a language of their own. Possibly some industries, I don't know, maybe in agriculture. The only time I've ever done creative writing was my first year here in 1970, University of Colorado. And I'd get these kids to come in and tell me about their backgrounds and where, you know, like, so one kid would tell me that he or she, I can't remember, is coming from the orange groves in California. I said, do you have a single poem about oranges? No.
So,
Was that approval, disapproval?
do you,
You're only oranges.
is there anything that poetry can't, that you can't write about in poetry?
No. No, and if you follow certain traditions and certain social mores, customs, whatever, you can do this, you can't do that, that does in one way or another seep into the arts. So then you get the rebellious person, you get a Rimbaud or somebody like that who just totally upsets the apple cart forever and maybe contributes to a change in the social mores. But the actual business of putting everything into a poem, personally, I learned from certain people. And it was epiphanic. I mean, it was quite extraordinary. One, I was extremely dissatisfied with, I mean, the whole reason I'm here is that I was extremely dissatisfied with what had happened to British poetry. In other words, poetry in English written by people in Britain. The background of that, of course, was the shrinking of the British experience by the loss of the empire in World War II. And suddenly this huge affair, this huge business, shrank back to the Little England. So you had these Little England movement, or a Little England movement with people deliberately writing in a constricted, corseted way. And one day Hugh MacDiarmid, the great Scottish poet, came to town. I realized I hadn't read him. I went to his reading, came out totally transformed. My God, you can say anything! You can do anything. You can say anything. And of course, I'd had suggestions of that from Pound, but nothing quite as immediate as that MacDiarmid thing. Then Olson, I guess my two the peaks, would be MacDiarmid on the other side of the pond and Olson on this side. So the answer is you can put anything whatsoever in poems.
Great. What are you working on now? What is the future of your, where's it going with your poetry, what's in your project?
Well, apart from being dead, it's going to be necessary to die. And I'm dealing at the moment with the realization that at my age there is absolutely no way in which I can skirt the matter and come out on the other side. One experiences that in one's youth, one experiences it in middle age, but when it comes to old age, it has a way of changing its behavior. And so the whole question of termination in a whole series of different ways, begins to be somewhat obsessive and also, I suppose, interesting. Very interesting, extremely interesting, actually. More interesting than anything else. I don't particularly want to spend the rest of my short time writing poems which are even more sad and miserable than the ones that I've already done. So there is the question of perhaps not writing anymore as a deliberate action. I remember Ted Anslin, who died recently. I don't know whether any of you know his work. Great, one of the major figures of our last decades. He said to me at one point, I think when he got to his 80th birthday, he said, I'm really not interested in writing anymore. He he said, I don't want to repeat. I feel that anything I would do now would be a repetition. Now that's already one problem, whether you feel that you're repeating yourself. The other problem is, you know, to what extent is there any point in doing anything while you're, you know, facing termination. And, however, as I think I may have said last night, I'm concerned with another, I'm fascinated and extremely interested in and terrified by another termination, which is the termination of us. I'm not an exact scientist, I'm an ex-social scientist, all I do is read the papers, but in the fields in which I'm interested, ecology, indigenous peoples, destruction of forests, all those things. The last poem in the book is what I call the Borneo poems, some work I did with an NGO in Borneo about destruction of forests and so on, but it's going on all over the world. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I feel that on balance, there is neither the economico, politico, sociologico will, particularly politics and economics, in the populations of the earth at this point, and the leaderships of the earth at this point, that are going to actually get us through what we are doing ourselves to the planet and therefore to ourselves. And, you know, I'm sure that a lot of people share that feeling. However, I suppose in a way that the younger you are, the more optimistic you are, the more you're going to, as it were, hope that eventually humanity will come to its senses somewhere before whatever the tipping point really is. There's a lot of talk about tipping points. Many scientists believe that we've gone past a whole bunch of tipping points. But presumably there is a major, big, giant, daddy, money tipping point that we'll go over one day without noticing, and that'll be the end of that. I'm not talking about the end of the planet. The planet will go on, but whether the human race goes on, to me, is extremely, extremely doubtful at this point. I mean, the way in which people manage to talk about the economy, the question of jobs, and all the rest of it. I'm not saying that these are not extremely serious questions, but sometimes when these immediate social questions are put in the balance with the actual fate of the race, you know, I just find that mind-boggling. I mean, they're just simply the human mind. I mean, humanity has not attained full humanity and may well never do so if things go on the way they're going. So, the personal termination at that point becomes really just a minor effect. But if the interest remains concentrated on the bigger problem, there have been poems on that, and there probably, or there may be more poems on that. I mean, I actually read last night 2 of the poems of a new thing called Exitus Generis Humani, the end of the human race, which is a bunch of poems in what may be another book. And this little tour is basically the first edition of that. I mean, I've never read them before. So, and they seem to have gone down fairly well. So I may go on with that. I have 2 or 3 books in text form, but I'm not even sure that I'm going to try and publish them. I may be absolutely happy to do the transit and just put those things in an archive.
Great, okay.
I don't know if that's any kind of answer.
No, it is. It's a wonderful answer. here's the last question. This is going back to something you mentioned earlier, which was, you were saying that poetry is very incestuous and that only poets read poetry. And it used to, I mean, I think it used to not be that way. I think there was
No, of course
there
not.
was, in the 19th century, definitely there was
Right.
a public occasions for poetry publicly. What could we do to make it, or should we make it that way again? Is there anything, just brainstorming, that you would think we could do?
No, you can't go back. This kind of activity, if it's done well, and you definitely seem to be doing it well, seems to me the best that one can do. You know, pay attention to potential readers, particularly those who have no intention of becoming poets themselves, but are just reading because they're interested in reading. And poems do something for them. But to change the state of society from savagery to back to civilization is somewhat difficult. As far as I'm concerned, we were in a state of savagery. Can we get back to civilization? I don't know. Of course, you'll always be told that, you know, every period has thought that the old days were better. The good old days, you know, the good old days are cliche. But it comes back again and again, and every generation is dissatisfied and seems to find a number of reasons why it was better 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, whatever. But that is all negotiable.
Well, that's the end of our questions. Do you have anything else you want to add or say?
No, I think it's rather... I don't think I've ever had an occasion quite like this, so you're obviously doing something which is rare. Or else I just, you know, haven't been invited to participate. Do you know of other situations anywhere where this kind of thing occurs?
No, in particular, when it's preserved on the website the way it is, it's unique as far as I know.
There are discussions at Poem Sound. Poem Sound. There are discussions where the convener, the head of that program,
Al Phillies or something.
Al, yes,
Yeah.
brings in 3 or 4 people to discuss a poem,
Yeah.
but not in the presence of the poet, I believe.
Right.
Certainly, I mean, I wasn't there when they did something like
Unless
that.
you can, I mean, call down Will Dickinson or something.
Right. But I mean, this kind of, you know, conversation after a reading, for instance, maybe it does take place in all sorts of places. I don't know. I've never experienced that.
Anyway, well, I want to thank you for participating. And we have more books for sale, and hopefully Mr. Tarn will sign them for you. So thanks for coming.
Thank you, sir.
Welcome, welcome.